Thank you. I feel like a bit of a change of pace after all that economics. You can now hear from a lawyer, you lucky souls. But please don't hold that against me. I've been asked to speak to you about the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, or the TTIP, as we decided to call it earlier. I'm going to try and answer three basic questions. What is it? Frankly, why do we care about it? And when might it come into force? And hopefully across the next half an hour, we'll get as far as we can towards some of the answers to some of those questions. But I think it's kind of important to maybe take a step back, and we've heard a lot about the economy and the global market, and have a think about actually some of the contextual things that sit behind this. Now, I'm going to come at this topic from a regulatory angle. I'm a regulatory lawyer. That's what I do. So it's the way I can really bring this alive. It is a vast topic, and there are lots of different nuances to it, and I can't profess to bring all of them to you, not least in half an hour. But this is a little bit of perhaps what's inside my head on any given day, but it's a little bit of what the industry's had to deal with over the last few years. So I'm thinking more the end user necessarily than the crop producers at this stage. We've had lots of issues with the change in regulation over the last decade. More or less every area of food regulation that could have been touched has been touched. Most recently, we had food labelling regulations change last December. At the moment, there are discussions about GM that were in the Parliament yesterday. There's been other GM legislation this year. We've got health claims regulation that manifestly changed the way in which we are able to make claims about our foodstuffs. And then we start to get into the health agenda and the compositional issues that have started to come along. We've gone through fat and salt, and we're now into the world of sugar tax and the debates around that and changing what that means for composition, which in turn means what we need to do to be able to produce foods that meet those consumer needs and hopefully avoid us all having a somewhat pointless tax at the end of it. But we have there's a lot of political debates ongoing as well. So we heard a bit about Brexit in the last speech, and we've also obviously got a Brexit debate coming up. And as a precursor to someone talking about TTIP, if we're a part of Europe, we benefit from that trade agreement, and we benefit from being able to be part of those negotiations. If we're not, we end up in a situation of some of our neighbour states where the US is supposed to have said to them, you can choose to trade on these terms or not at all. We've got a lot of big questions coming forward for the industry, and whether we can truly achieve the EU's objective of an ever closer union, or whether we can actually achieve that within the United Kingdom ourselves, as the question about Scotland continues to loom on the agenda. Who'd have thought you got so much politics out of a lawyer in 5 minutes? So I like to think about things in have little images to try and kind of sum up the thought process. I mean, when we want regulation and looking at the future, we really want to know what is the road ahead. Ideally, we want some beautiful blue skies. We know where we're going. We know there's going to be a change in the future, and we can plan for it. It's trying to bring that piece out. In reality, it's a bit more like this. We're seeing a lot of cloudy skies. There's a lot of stuff that is changing, and it's not changing necessarily the most thought through or effective fashion. And we're having to get around the hazards and the lightning in the road. And so GM and organic are two good examples of that. And we've had propositions for organic regulation for a couple of years that have been negotiating back and forth, and there's been a political hot potato and a game of ping pong going on with both those areas. And only this year, I mean, the GM in particular has been a political hot potato and has been something of a bargaining chip in the TTIP negotiations. I think it comes as no, it is not a coincidence that the most recent legislation about the usage of the consumption of GM foods in a member state and the ability to ban that came during the course of the last but one round of negotiations when they were talking about issues of this sort. But we'll come back to that in a little while. It is also important for context to recognise that, as this image shows, TTIP is not the only game in town. It isn't the only bilateral or trilateral trade agreement that the EU has. The image shows that the areas where the EU has either negotiated or has negotiated an agreement. It covers pretty much the entire globe. So one wonders, well, why is TTIP really getting all that press? Why is it such a focus of attention? Well, the EU's helped me by trying to show how these trade agreements affect the EU's free movement. So in the EU, they've got the free movement of goods, services, people, and so forth. And most of those trade agreements affect the majority of those areas, with the exception of persons. And when we get down to TTIP is the third from the bottom there. It's only hitting 3 of the areas. So again, you wonder, why? Well, why is it that this is creating so much press and creating so much debate? Particularly when one looks at the line above, the row above, and we see CETA, the Canadian trade agreement, which affects all of the 5 freedoms that the European Union has sought to protect. And CETA, I think, is a really good view into the future as to what TTIP may look like. And so perhaps I should really be talking about that in far more depth than I'm going to, because the CETA agreement is 1,634 pages of excitement. And buried within that, there are all kinds of details that it's quite difficult to find. But what it does, or what it seeks to do, is exactly the same thing that TTIP tries to do with the US. It's trying to engage greater trade. It's trying to remove unnecessary barriers. But it builds on trade agreements and bilateral agreements that are already in place between those 2 nations. So, for example, there is a veterinary agreement in relation to meat between Canada and the EU, and so that's built into CETA. Likewise, in relation to wine growing and grapes and so forth, there's a similar type of agreement. It's built in. So it picks up on the agreements we already have and takes them to a new level to try and avoid unnecessary barriers to trade. And the idea is we end up with, on the tariff side, we lose about 90% of tariffs straight away, and then over the following 7 years, they get rid of a few more percentage points of tariffs. So it removes the initial financial burdens, as well as then looking to the technical barriers to trade that occur on a local basis, so things like unnecessary regulation or unnecessary red tape. But it's interesting that CETA has really got a lot of, people started to wake up to that. There are a couple of articles in the press last week and the week before about this agreement and describing it in similarly alarmist terms as we've come to hear about TTIP. But also it's important, what wasn't on the EU's diagram, of course, is the World Trade Organization and the work that it's done in freeing up world markets. And what's important about both the CETA agreement and also the TTIP agreement is that they build on, again, principles that are found in the World Trade Organization agreement. So the phrases like technical barriers to trade and the principles behind it are again, imported from what the World Trade Organization has tried to do and put into both CETA and TTIP. Likewise, for sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the things that deal with how we produce the foods are also incorporated. So it's not quite as simple as saying, well, the EU and the US are busily negotiating this agreement that's going to, well, depending on which political view you subscribe to, either massively open markets and create lots of more opportunity and jobs, or alternatively destroy the world. It's not quite as simple as all that. There are a lot of other things going on in the background, and this is just an evolutionary step. And I think it's significant that the World Trade Organization has been trying for the best part of 2 decades to create a global agreement, but has not been able to achieve it. And I suppose that's it's inevitability given the number of members of that organization. And so we've seen more and more bilateral and trilateral, in the case of the Transatlantic Trans-Pacific Partnership with the US and the Pacific Rim, up to 12 or 13 partners, trying to get together when they've got a common interest and common themes to push particular agendas forward. That was a relatively long introduction to what is TTIP and what we need to think about in the background, because it's not just this agreement. There's a lot of other stuff that is floating around here. So as we should have kind of gathered by now, the TTIP agreement is aiming to facilitate the removal of unnecessary barriers to trade. It's trying to make the EU and US systems far more compatible and remove the unnecessary differences. If there is a necessary reason for it to be there, and there is a safety requirement or some other particular requirement, then it may remain. But if there is no necessary need for it to be there, they want to try and remove those wherever possible and move to more global harmonized standards. So if we think Codex and similar things that can flow from World Trade Organization agreements, it's, I think, where the future will take us. it's a negotiation, as one would expect. It's a politically ratified and agreed negotiation, and that's been going on for the last 2 years, this negotiation process. The pace has picked up slightly, insofar as negotiations every 3 months can be said to be fast. It is moving forward. The next round of negotiations is due to take place later this month, and will hopefully move us further forward towards a deal. It's not something that it will then come forward into a document which will be publicly available for consideration. That will have legal analysis by the EU. It'll have to be ratified by both the European Union as well as the member states. So there is quite a large degree of political oversight that will occur as a result of it. But nonetheless, we've still got a lot of strong public opinion about this, and it's got a huge amount of negativity to overcome, particularly around questions of transparency and what the negotiations are actually including. And that's quite a difficult thing to actually get to the bottom of. The EU website has got a lot of information on it, but it doesn't tell you the granular detail of the particular topics. You can listen to the press releases, press conferences, and read the press releases after the negotiation rounds. You can be involved in the stakeholder groups, and you can find out more of what is being discussed. But as far as the actual detail of the exact text, we don't have that information. And of course, there are a huge amount of very emotive topics that are a part of this, and food is one of the most emotive areas covered by this agreement. At every turn, there are more and more headlines and more concerns about what the agreement might mean and how it might work in practice. And the last press clipping there has been one of the most significant and challenging areas, and that relates to how you deal with disputes where the investor, i.e. a business, has suffered as a result of the state implementing a practice. And there exists at the moment a tribunal that hears these matters. And this agreement and CETA before it have tried to find a way to make that process more transparent and more open. And at the moment, there are several rounds of inter-negotiation discussions going on about what that will look like in the future. But it's a big area to watch out for. But in the absence of actual information, we've ended up with lots of myths, and people have essentially, I guess as is human nature, inserted their own truths. And this quote from Pascal Lamy is one of my favourites, and kind of sums up the way in which this is coming out. Because on the one hand, you've got everyone on the EU side allegedly concerned by chlorine-rinsed chickens or other US practices. For that, you can assert GM or any other thing that may be politically unfavourable on this side of the Atlantic. And on the other side, you've got the cheese approach for their concern about our blue cheeses. And the assumption being that somehow we'll be lowering the safety standards. And I think the important thing there is that whilst they want to achieve an ambitious and balanced deal, the idea is it comes with safeguards, and it's supposed to ensure that the safety standards are maintained. The practical side of that is incredibly difficult to achieve, however, especially when we're bombarded with fairly negative headlines and a very vociferous anti-TTIP lobby. My presentation felt a little bit deficient. I don't have as many graphs or statistics as the other guys have had this morning, so I've had to borrow from the EU's website to give my one graph, so there it is. Please enjoy. But the important thing about this is that the opportunity here is to grow trade. A gentleman from BIS told me that we currently do about £1.8 billion worth of trade with the US every single day. So it's a huge market. At the moment, we have a trade surplus in the EU's favour. And the expectation is that if we work to remove barriers to trade, if a 25% reduction will increase trade by about 40%. But there's a risk that because of the trade surplus that's in the EU's favour, that will benefit the US side of the agreement initially. Because I don't think that would be a fairly simplistic analysis to do, and I think it needs greater consideration than that. And the important thing is it's not just the tariffs and removing import duties or taxation that will have an effect. It's actually all the other things, the red tape, the regulation, the administrative burdens. is where actually the cost saving comes from, and where the growth opportunities lie. And it's in those areas that both the really emotive issues are found and also the biggest challenges. And there's the numbers behind it. And so in very simple terms, when you've got an issue like GM or any of those other really emotive issues, and you've got on one side of the Atlantic you have a standard that's up here, and on the other side of the Atlantic you have a standard that's, for sake of illustration, down here, how do you create equivalence between those two standards? Well, do you say that the lower standard, the lower standard is equivalent to the higher standard and therefore they can come into the market? Well, if they do that, well, there's obviously a lower cost to achieve the lower standard, so that's not fair on the higher market. Likewise, if you were to move the higher standard down, well, that's not a great deal for consumers either. So how do we achieve that? The simple answer is, of course, move both standards up to achieve the same level, but that increases cost for the lower state. And then who's to decide in some of these more some simpler areas, like, say, for example, food labeling, when you've got the same type of information on packs of food. And you in the US, you do your nutrition labeling one way, and we do it another way in Europe. Well, who's to say which one is better, and therefore who has to change? It's in a very simple example. It outlines a whole range of very difficult issues, and that's before you start to get into the more emotive areas. So, as far as the organisation of TTIP is concerned, it's in three sections: market access, regulatory cooperation, and rules. And those sectors are broken down to achieve the 24 chapters that I mentioned earlier. And you'd be glad to know I'm not going to go through all of them. And then in part that's because the information simply isn't available to do that. But what I'm going to focus on is just to pick out a few that are most relevant and see what that might mean for us. Although we can't see what the end document will look like, we can see the EU's initial draft proposal to the US, and that's available publicly on the EU website to download, amongst a whole range of other information that they're provided. And the principles around the regulatory cooperation chapter are fairly sensible and straightforward. We want to work together to ensure that regulations we are going to implement in our market are not going to adversely affect international trade. And as a result, we'll talk to you before we do something, and you'll talk to us, and hopefully we'll assure that what we're doing is broadly harmonious, which in lots of levels makes a great deal of sense. And so the articles in this section really express that sentiment, and they talk about setting up a committee to manage this and promoting regulatory compatibility between the various regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, all of which makes a great deal of sense. And then at the end of that, there's a stakeholder meeting where people can discuss how these issues are to be addressed. But the more difficult area is in the technical barriers to trade. And it's in this space where we start to explore the difficult topics. And food is one of the most challenging. And we can see on this slide the list of things and areas in which they are seeking to have cooperation. So technical regulations, standards, metrology, conformity assessment procedures, accreditation, market surveillance and monitoring, and enforcement activities. It's pretty much everything to do with the entire supply chain is within the scope of this. So there's a lot of things within the target of this agreement, and a lot of areas in which potentially a change could be made. Now, depending on where one sits on your viewpoint with it, this could either be a beneficial thing on the basis that we try and remove the sharp edges, and we find a sensible balance to having consistent agreement across multiple jurisdictions, or it impedes trade. It removes our ability to be innovative and to move and to do things as we wish. I've heard it argued that the word culture is in agriculture for a reason. It's about it's delivering the localism, the part of the. It's not agribusiness, which, well, that's a viewpoint, and that was being pushed very heavily by the civil society's agenda, and we find, until we actually see the exact detail of what has been agreed and what has been carved out of this agreement, there is a vacuum in which it's very easy to scaremonger and to find ways in which this could be a real problem. Likewise, if we're doing business across the Atlantic and there are unnecessary differences, it seems to me if they disappear and the fundamental standards are maintained so that safety and the consumer protection are maintained, then that must be a good thing. But I appreciate there are those that take a very different view. So this section is all about trying to achieve that cooperation and trying to achieve the same standards, making sure that we're not having unnecessary rules and we're not that conflict with each other. And what you'll see from these words, and I'm not going to read them out or indeed go through them, is these are very general sections. They're not dealing in minutiae, they're not dealing in granular detail about any particular sector or any particular issue. What they are saying is that this is the objective we want to achieve, and this is how we think we might be able to do it by working closer together to achieve harmonization. And it creates a great opportunity. So to come back to a couple of very simple examples, in the ways in which we are very different. In the US, it is possible to make a health claim about vegetables and grains that says that it may reduce the risk of some types of cancer. This is in the US law. It's a permitted claim. That's the wording that's actually in the legislation. In the EU, there's nothing. You can't make a claim anything like that. You can only say the closest you can get to making a claim in relation to grain is to talk about fecal bulk, and I apologise talking about fecal bulk just before lunch. The point is the science will be international science. It's a question about interpretation and why in the US it's been interpreted to be okay to say this, and in the EU it's not. So we've got a vast difference there. We need to find a way to try and create a more harmonised approach to avoid that, and so that the claims that we can make in the US are the same as in the EU and vice versa. It will make everybody's life that much easier. And to use my label example from earlier, and this is the example of breakfast one day, and if you go to the US, this label would look fundamentally different. It would tell you pretty much the same things, but it would look different. Why? It's just as a simple practical step. It doesn't need to. Now, there's an argument to say these are the least of our worries. These are not the big ticket things that will make a massive difference to the cost of doing business and cost of international trade. I'm just using these as indicators of simple things that could be done without a great deal of challenge before you get into the real nitty-gritty of things like GM that really polarize viewpoints. So there is an entire chapter dedicated to food safety, and that includes both animal health and plant health. So that's an important chapter. And just like the technical barriers to trade, that picks up the World Trade Organization text in this space. So it is building on what we already have and know. But what it's trying to achieve, again, is a degree of agreement about what is accepted, what is safe, and how do we want to approach this. So Clause 13 there, for example, every party shall ensure that products exported to the other party meet the appropriate level of protection for the importing party, the responsibility, etc. And it goes on to say that it may require you to demonstrate that it meets, that objectively demonstrate to satisfaction of the importing party that the import requirements are fulfilled. The point is, it's saying that if it's safe in your jurisdiction, you can demonstrate it's safe, then it should in theory be safe in the other nation as well, which in the case of things like GM, in the case of in the case of some of the practices that are used for like hormone in terms of beef and poultry and so forth, it creates an interesting conversation about how that particular process will be managed and whether it will be carved out and what this agreement will look like in the end to ensure that we are achieving it. And the same principle is there in equivalence. So I've touched on GMOs a few times, and I make no apology for coming back to it again. I mean, it's interesting to see that in recent months the US position on GMOs has shifted. There's been an attempt to have greater labelling requirements in relation to to GM products. And yesterday there was a legal challenge on that, I understand. And on this side of the Atlantic, back in April, we had a legislative proposal about prohibiting what I've described NIMBYism. We'll not have GM in our backyard as far as it being on the market, and that comes after we've already put in place the ability to opt out from having the cultivation of GM. We have one approved GM crop, maize, as far as cultivation, and I think there are 58 as far as the consumption is concerned. So it's a relatively small market at the moment. And through that debate process, at the beginning of October, the timescale, the time period closed for nations to opt out, and depending on which press report you read, somewhere between half and 20 member states have decided to opt out of having GM on their soil. So it's interesting to see the way in which the tide is moving on this, and this is all happening whilst the EU and the US are negotiating these provisions and discussing how are we going to make this equivalence work. Well, if we've got the EU pushing in one direction, one expects that GMOs will be outside of the scope of it. But if they are, how given the importance of GMOs historically in the US market, what will we have to give up in return for that not being part of the agreement? I mean, that said, the EU Parliament only yesterday voted against putting forward the consumption opt-out legislation. So there's still some political debate to be had on this side of the Atlantic as well. And so you get into the other emotive areas, and hormone beef is something that's been really is already subject to a WTO agreement, and there are already payments that are in relation to this. So whether that will then feature a specific opt-out in the TTIP agreement, it remains to be seen. And it starts to illustrate the other big topics and the difficult areas that we have to deal with. We've got a change in novel food regulation potentially coming down the track. We've got disparate hygiene procedures, we've got different labelling procedures, we've got different approaches to farming in certain areas. We've got different approaches to the retail of food. There are some considerable gulfs between us. Now, in principle, that doesn't prohibit or prevent any form of agreement being reached, but it does make it more challenging. And with any negotiation, one will no doubt have to give up something in order to achieve it. And we saw that in the CETA agreement, where the EU had to give up some trade subsidies in return for retaining the geographical indication protections. Now, so it's a give and take, and we'll have to, as an industry, keep watching these negotiations to see where they go and make sure that the areas that we truly care about are included within the final text and are being discussed. And there are sustainable development, I believe, is on the agenda for the next time round, which has links into organic and various other topics as well. There's a lot of things still to be discussed, and we need to kind of watch this space and keep a close eye on it. 11th round of negotiations happen, I think it's the back end of next week, and they start. So you will start to see a lot more press about TTIP again, and it'll be a time to do it. If you're not engaged in the debate, to start to follow it slightly more closely and see exactly what has been negotiated. It was said that the aim was to have the negotiations concluded by the tail end of this year. That seems somewhat optimistic. There was some brilliant political speak by Angela Merkel saying that still remains our objective. Of course, there's a fundamental difference between an objective and something actually happening. And Obama had intended to have it completed by the end of his administration, which is a slightly more realistic timetable. But still, given some of the noises that you hear coming out of the negotiations, that they're less than halfway through it, it feels like it's still fairly ambitious, which is good news if you want to be engaged in negotiations. You want to have the conversations and push particular issues, because there is still time, there are still issues, there's still an opportunity, but it continues to be a political hot potato. And we have to wait and see how exactly it continues. As you've got both sides, the Atlantic alleging that each other is not moving fast enough. Commissioner Hogan from the EU saying that the US is not really being fully engaging properly. And perhaps that's in part because of the focus on the Trans-Pacific Agreement. And now that's concluded, it gives them an opportunity to focus more centrally on this side of the Atlantic and push things forward with us. And then you have the question about whether it would ever be ratified anyway across the EU, given the growing political concern about it. Apparently all 56 MPs have signed a motion against it. Only last week there are something like 300,000 people in Germany protesting against it. There's a lot of anti-TTIP feeling out there, and so much like the Brexit debate, there's a lot of discussion still to be had and engagement needed with the general public as well as with business and the rest of industry. So to kind of wrap that up, it's a canter through what is going on and where it might take us. It is deliberately high level. There's a lot still, because there's a lot still to be done, and the devil will ultimately be in the detail. CETA is 1,634 pages. It's incredibly likely that TTIP will be even longer and contain even more opt-outs and even more detail. But there's still an opportunity to get voices heard and to be engaged. The EU is apparently has an open door policy and wants to hear what the issues are and what things are concerning. So there's an opportunity to push those messages through and to make sure that if there's an industry where there are things that needs to be included or indeed excluded, that debate is had rather than just reacting after the agreement is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I certainly don't think VW have helped the case of EU's ability to comply with regulation. Are there any questions? There's two questions here. Have we got a microphone at all? Yes, we have. We'll take three questions and then there's a question at the back. We've just got time for them.
I'll share. As it seems to me, there are fundamental differences between the US and the EU on...
Some microphone just behind you.
As it seems to me, there are fundamental questions between the EU and US on some really key issues. Is it possible that TTIP could be signed with individual member states, or is it possible that bits of TTIP could be agreed and others left on the table?
I think that latter certainly is possible. It could be an agreement that excludes certain areas, but the political feeling on both sides of the Atlantic is if food isn't part of it, then it's so important that the whole thing may fall away. So you may see certain areas within the food topic being carved up and moved outside of the scope of it. I think it's less likely to happen on a single member state or group of member states level, but never say never. And it depends on how far down the track you get. Only from the US's side, why would you want to negotiate with single member states when you've got a group representing the entirety of them? They might take the view that it's better to have something rather than nothing, but my gut feeling would be that it wouldn't happen if...
Question over.
Hello. How many years do you think these negotiations could last? So this is my first question. And I have another one regarding the Pacific Partnership, which has been achieved last week. Do you have any information on the impact on the agricultural sector of it?
How long might it take? I think the answer is... it was supposed to happen by the end of the year or by the end of Obama's administration. I think that's optimistic. It could realistically, if we are to believe that we're only halfway through the process and it's taken 2 years so far, it's not beyond the realms of possibility it would take a further 2 years. But I think at least another year is realistic. But having the actual agreement is just the first stage of it. It's then got to go through a process of being approved politically and get legal assessments by each of the member states. So you've got another process behind that. Using CETA as a comparison, I think the text on that was agreed middle of last year, and it's still not in force. So you're looking at quite a long tail on working through the political machine to get it into force. As far as Trans-Pacific, yes, there is lots of stuff in there about food. I haven't got enough time to go into it, but we can talk about it afterwards if you like.
Final question over there.
Are there anything involved in this discussion with TTIP concerning production subsidies? I don't know whether or not this covers the remit of TTIP, or we're only talking about regulation. I'm thinking in particular about the US's commitment in the WTO to commit to decoupling production subsidies. The EU went down that track and began the decoupling process, and the US said, no, let's just forget about that and start subsidising our production again. Given that that gives them a competitive edge considerably against us within Europe, is there any negotiating position within the EU delegation to say, hold on a second, you didn't honour those agreements, therefore why should we be freeing up any more of our trade to you? That's my opinion, but I don't know whether or not there's any kind of discussion being had within that area, within TTIP, and I'd like to know if there is. Thanks.
I haven't heard a specific discussion on that topic, but trade tariffs and duties and so forth are certainly part of the discussions. Whether those specific tariffs and whether on the previous behaviour form part of the negotiation, I would imagine that it sounds like a fairly sensible negotiating position or tool to use. So I would be surprised if it hasn't, but it's a huge topic and multifaceted.